All right, now we're going to look at how we can measure variables. Ending statistics, there are four main categories for your levels of measurement. Okay, there's nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Now, if you're dealing with categorical data, then you're going to be looking at these two levels of measurement. Nominal and ordinal deal with categorical data. Once you narrow it down to nominal and ordinal, the way that you can figure out which category that it fits in as far as measurement scales is you want to ask yourself, can these categories be ordered? So, nominal measurement scales, those are categories that don't have any kind of logical progression or any kind of specific order. If you have categorical data that you can order from smallest to largest or by rank in some way, then that would be considered ordinal. When you're dealing with numerical data or quantitative data, then you're going to be using these two levels of measurement, interval or ratio. Now, the difference between these two levels of measurement when you're dealing with numerical data is you want to look to see if you have what's called a true zero. It's listed in here. A true zero means if you have zero of something, that indicates that you have nothing. There's an absence of whatever it is that you're talking about. There are values that can take on a zero value, but doesn't necessarily mean that there is nothing there. It is like a placeholder on like the number line. If you look at zero on the number line, that doesn't mean that you have zero numbers. It's just the value that separates the positive and the negative numbers. So if you have data that has what's called a true zero, then you want to use ratio level of measurement. If you have a value of zero that you can use for your data, but it doesn't indicate that you have none of whatever that item is that you're looking at for your data, then you're talking about interval. A true zero means if you have zero of something, there is nothing. So another example of a value of zero that isn't considered a true zero, and it has this example here, is temperature. When you look at the scale on a temperature gauge, that zero, when you see that it's 0 degrees, that doesn't mean that there's no temperature. It's a placeholder. All right, let's look at example 4. We're going to classify the level of measurement for blood types. These are categories. If you have type A, type B, type AB, or type O blood, these are considered categories. So right away, I know that my level of measurement is going to be either nominal or ordinal. Now, the question on how we narrow it down between the two is, can I order these in a way that makes sense? If I order these, can it go from increasing to decreasing, or is there some kind of rank that one is more important than the other? Now, because these don't have any kind of order to it, this would be considered nominal, right? Nominal are categories without order, okay? So I would choose A for this example. Let's look at example 5. Example 5 says classify the level of measurement. This is a customer's satisfaction rated as unsatisfied, neutral, or satisfied. These are definitely categories. So we know we're going to use either nominal or ordinal. Can I order these in some way that makes sense from smallest to largest or some kind of rank? And we can. It's ordered just that way. I would say unsatisfied would be the lowest, satisfied would be the highest, and neutral's in the middle. Because this is something that can be ordered, categories that can be ordered are considered ordinal level of measurement. Let's look at example 6. We're going to classify the level of measurement, temperature measured in Fahrenheit across different cities. This data is measured. It's a numerical value, so we would use either ratio or interval. We would only use ratio if we consider that the data has a true 0. And as we talked about, temperature is an example of where we could have a value of 0, but it doesn't mean the absence of temperature. So a 0 degree Fahrenheit doesn't mean that there's an absence. It's not a true 0. So that means if we don't have a true 0, we would use interval. So we would use we would choose option D for the answer for that. All right, example 7, the last one, classify the level of measurement, time in minutes spent exercising each day. Time in minutes, that's something that's measured, so we know it's some kind of a value, and it's a numerical value, so that means we're going to be using interval or ratio. Now, to narrow it down, we have to ask ourselves, is there a true 0? So if I ask myself, does 0 minutes mean the absence of minutes? 0 minutes means there's no minutes, no time has passed. So that means this data set would have a true 0. And when we have a true 0, we would say that that's a level of measurement called ratio. Okay, so wrapping up this lesson, first, we need to figure out if the data is qualitative or quantitative. And remember, quantitative can be broken down into countable or uncountable. If it's uncountable, then we would consider that continuous. We also talked about levels of measurement. We have the categorical levels of measurement, which is the nominal or ordinal, and to tell the difference between those two, we would decide if you can order the data. If you have levels of measurement when you're dealing with quantitative data, then you want to choose between interval or ratio. And then the way to narrow down the difference between those two is ask yourself, does it have a true 0? 0 of whatever it is that you have, does that mean you have an absence of whatever that is? If it's an absence of whatever it is that you're talking about and it's not just a placeholder, then that's considered a true 0 and you would use ratio. If you do not have a true 0, then you would use interval.